to echo some of what was said, for sure, we all are very fond of the idea that God is love. And it's great for bumper stickers, and it's good when somebody asks you, what do you believe? Well, I believe that God is love. But what does it mean in the context of this letter? Because we said we sort of got into this letter because this phrase comes from it, and we wanted to be faithful to the fact that we can't just cherry pick out the 3 words that we like and ignore the fact that they come from somewhere. They come from a community. So otherwise, what we do is we end up reading God is love through our views and our desires, and we always interpret it as our intended meaning. So I'm wondering what these authors mean and sort of how they surround this beautiful phrase. That's what I want to look at tonight. So let's begin here. Love appears 14 times in 6 verses. That's a whole lot of love. Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. Notice he doesn't answer the questions about like hate and what if you hate and love. What he says is if you love, born of God. I'm just going to leave that there. So God is love. God is love. We've come to celebrate the idea. And without going into a ton of detail, the sort of philosophical grounding in my mind for this is to recognize that love is not an attribute of God. It's not the behavior of God. It's not a metaphor for God. We're not making a simile like God is like love, saying that love is the very nature of God, the essence, the DNA. God does not perform love, nor simply inspire us to love. He's saying God is love. And Pete Rollins does a good job of pointing this out in a way that I think we miss. And he uses light, and we've talked about this before. God is not the object of our love, any more than light is the object of our sight. We don't see light, nor do we look for light. It's light that enables us to see. Light is not visible. Instead, light renders the world visible. So same with God and love. We don't love God, Pete says. God is not the object of our love. Rather, God is the name of the experience of love itself. It's what's happening between people when we love, that which enables us to love, we might say. He gives this example. This sounds tinny. Does that sound tinny to you? You take some of maybe it's just me. I'm hearing it right there. Tin can. So he gives this example. And I've experienced this the first time I went to New York City. It was overwhelming emotionally. He says, think about walking on a busy street and you come upon someone you love. While you're walking, you're passing hundreds of people and you do not really see them. You might register them as objects just to avoid them, but they don't stand out to you. But when you see someone you love, they stand forth from the background. They arise from that mass of others as distinct. Someone you can see. So with this in mind, God, we could say, is the name that we give to that experience where things are called into existence for us, where God is not seen, but is testified to in a particular way of seeing. So God is love. As it says at the end of this passage, God can't be seen. No one has seen God. So God is not an object. We could say God is not a being, but rather God is testified to in a particular way of being, namely love. And loving one another, right? The ones who we can see, that's this experience of God. So God is love. Great. This helps name and identify God. But the thing that's actually much more fascinating to me than that little phrase, God is love, especially because it's Advent, and the story is that gods are being born amid the scandal of teenage unwed mothers. God is being born in people, is not God is love. What's fascinating to me is what the passage actually says about us, about people. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Everyone who loves. And note, it doesn't name with any more specificity than that the object of our love. It doesn't say that we have to love God or we have to love Christianity or we have to love even in any particular way. It's very generic. Everyone who loves. Maybe even the ones who hate, but who also love. The ones who love, everyone who loves is born of God. Offspring, son or daughter, family, kin, however you want to put it. One of my favorite podcasts, actually, the host says this. He chooses very specifically not to say kingdom of God. He actually says kingdom of God, which I think is so great, as in the domain of God's family, rather than the domain of God's kingship. And God's family, by the way, everybody. Everybody. Now, this is fascinating because in the next passage, we actually get some serious internal tension and static in this passage, this question. So this is how God showed his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. Now, the phrase one and only is fascinating. John loves this phrase, the John community. Throughout the Gospel of John, we see this, the famous verse, John 3:16. God sent his one and only Son, or only begotten, which is interesting. The NASB translates tonight's passage in that same way. It's not one and only, but only begotten. So it can be translated sort of in both ways, apparently. Begotten means born. So some people say one and only, some people say the only born Son of God. The only born Son of God, right? And for many people, Advent, getting ready for Christmas, is about the fact that there is only one. The only born Son of God. The only born Son of God. The only born Son of God. Everyone who loves is born of God. The only born Son of God. Everyone who loves is what is going on? That's some serious internal tension in this text, because he's just said everyone who loves, born of God. And then the very next verse apparently says only one is born of God. So here's the deal, and I don't want to offend anybody, but I think Jesus as the only Son, or the only begotten, the only born Son, is actually pretty bad news. It's really what that means is that none of us have been born of God. None of us are children of God. Merry Christmas. Go in peace. There's something going on. Something's off in this passage with the way that we've typically heard it and sort of been told to understand it. The issue, surprise, is in the Greek. And we spent a bunch of time in the original language to try and make sense of this. But here, this phrase, one and only, or only begotten, only born, the word that's translated both of those ways is monogene. Monogene, Greek word. Fascinatingly, it contains neither the word only nor begotten. It doesn't contain the word only. It doesn't contain the word born at all. Neither of those are in this phrase. Mono is one, as in mono and mono, or monotheism, or mono, the one kissing disease to rule them all. Mono equals one. Mono. So it does say one. It does say one. Gene, this Greek word, we would say it in English, gene. Gene. It's translated kind. Kind. Not like be nice to your brother or sister, but genus, species. And so monogene is best translated one of a kind. One of a kind. Not only begotten, not one and only, but one of a kind. We could also say unique. We could say special. And I can't tell you how many people I know, how many conversations I've had here with folks outside of our community who I think would really like to be a part of Christianity. They'd certainly like to be a part of a community. For whatever reason, this has sort of been the wall for them. They can't get past it. This idea that Jesus is the one and only, the only begotten Son of God, as if Jesus is God, and then sort of God no longer matters. It becomes all about Jesus, sort of like Jesus worship cult thing. And they say things like this, and you guys have had conversations like this. Of course I think Jesus is special, right? He probably was a prophet. Of course I think he's unique. Of course I think he was a Son of God, but it's the Son of God thing, the one and only, or the only born. And they say to me, of course, Jesus was very important, like Gandhi or Martin Luther King, like any of these leaders who have changed the world. Interestingly, in this passage on the first Sunday of Advent, I think what we find is agreement. Agreement. Jesus is one of a kind. Jesus is unique. Jesus is incredibly special. But he's not the only one. He's not the only one. I'm honestly kind of wondering if I'm going to have a job tomorrow because you guys are being very quiet. And this is not, I think, this is not sacrilegious. I don't think this is heresy. Actually, I think this is the point of Christianity. Remember, because Jesus says at the end of John's gospel, the same Spirit that makes me the anointed one will be in you. And he says the people that come after him will do even greater things. It sounds like the point is that he's not the only one. Not the only one, not one and only, not the only born. Lots of other folks are born of God, and you can see them all around you. Just look for the love. And for many, even conservative Christians, this born of God thing isn't exclusive to Jesus, right? But it's very quickly turned back into a singular and exclusive mark of admission or belonging with questions like this: are you born again? As if this is a status, or it's an event, or it's a one-time deal. And then all sorts of things get attached, like these little proofs and little tests. Like, well, you're not born again unless you speak in tongues. You're not born again unless you've received the ghost, whatever the hell that means, or whatever else. And here again, it says, everyone who loves is born of God. That's the singular litmus test. Apparently, just according to this letter, everyone who loves. Apparently, born again actually means love again. It's a practice, an ongoing way of living. It's not some belief, but it is our actions, as several of you pointed out. So if you're asked, are you born again? You can say, yeah, every time I love. Every time I love, I'm born again, and again, and again, and again. And I think the same with Christmas, especially for people who are not like religious or don't consider themselves Christian, or they're not really sure. But if people ask you, and people ask because it's, PC police and all that, do you celebrate Christmas as if it's just a day or as if it's just a season? But what we're saying is this is really what's beneath Christmas, right? This anticipation and preparation and Advent for the birth of God in the love of Jesus, who then points to the birth of God in the love of everyone who loves. Everyone who loves. So sure, I celebrate Christmas, not just in December and not just on that particular day. I celebrate Christmas every time I love. Because God is born each and every time I love. Now, this resolves this tension and the contradiction in the passage, but there is still this question of what we mean when we talk about Jesus being unique. In the letter, this little passage at least gives two reasons. And I want to start with the second one because it's super weird. And it's actually very foreign to this letter. We don't actually find this much in the letter of 1 John. So this is the one we'll talk about first. God sent his son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. How many of you have heard that understanding of this is what Jesus is, this is what Jesus does, this is why Jesus is special? Okay, so a good portion of us, that's good. And I would agree, just reading that on face value, I would say that would make someone unique to do that or perform that. And this is, I think, probably the one that is most familiar, at least to modern Christianity. It's language that if you haven't heard it, if you're not familiar with that language, it sounds like, to put it politely, it sounds like wacky religious jargon. To put it sort of in collective terms, it kind of sounds like bullshit. Like, if you're not familiar with this, and you don't have any idea what it is or what it means, it doesn't make any sense. And part of why it sounds so odd is that this comes from a strange, obscure religious belief system that is thousands of years old, and actually no one in our culture believes this. No one in our culture believes this. Let me say this as clearly as I possibly can. Atoning sacrifice for our sins is a metaphor. It's a metaphor. And this shouldn't be a surprise. The John community, the writings they produce, they are chiefly mystical. They're metaphorical. They are not meant to be understood literally. So the ancient culture that they come from worked in this way. And not only do we not work in this way anymore, these beliefs are so weird. They're really weird. It's wacky that we would even talk about this stuff, even though so much of modern Christianity pretends that this is totally normal and tries to convince people really hard to believe this literally. This is a metaphor, and it's trying to help make sense of Jesus' uniqueness. And so the author, 2,000 years ago, used an image that was familiar to that audience. In this culture at the time, they functioned with the belief that if you did something wrong, what they would call a sin, or you offended God, or you broke the covenant with your community, you broke the social contract, the way that you would deal with that is you would choose an animal to substitute for you, and you would have it ceremonially slaughtered by a priest, and somehow magically that would cause the sin to go away from you because that animal died, which is weird. Right? That's weird. And I have been in church for 18 years, and I've never heard anyone explain that and say, this is weird. It's okay for us all to think this is weird. Listen, how many of you are doing this on a regular basis? Right? Except, obviously, for Nate, but he's weird, so. Listen, I am a minister with advanced training in the sacred arts, theology, spirituality. I am ordained with full sacramental authority, and I do not do this, and I have never done this, and I don't know anyone who does this or has ever done this. Ever. This is the foundation of what is called substitutionary atonement. And it gets more complex. You can get different animals of different sizes, and they're worth more or less sins, which oddly enough means that the rich get to sin more. Totally different sermon. Social commentary there. Not surprisingly, you had to buy these animals from the very temple that was performing the sacrifice. This was a racket. And the temple was crushing it. They were making such a profit. Very profitable business atoning for sins, by the way. If we have like a doomsday sort of post-apocalyptic thing and this temple sacrifice thing comes back around, good money to be made in that. But frankly, horribly unjust. Hence the Hebrew prophets, hence Jesus' indignation at the religious establishment, hence Jesus coming into the temple and turning over tables and critiquing this very system. This is how things worked, though. And for lack of any other belief system in the culture, you had to do it. This is just how things worked. It's how they understood the world to work. And so, of course, when you're asked, why is Jesus unique? What makes him one of a kind? You grab this metaphor and you start to go, Jesus is the ultimate understanding of this, right? The sacrifice, the temple system, all this stuff. And so whether it's John or Paul or even Jesus himself using this imagery, what they're saying is Jesus' life and death either satisfied or forgave. And they sort of use both of those, this moral debt. Which satisfaction I don't really like because it actually legitimizes this practice as if Jesus is the ultimate goat and ultimately just satisfies the system, right? Like as if this debt actually exists and it needs to be paid. And so Jesus dies and it pays it. Forgiveness, on the other hand, renders the debt undone. There is no more need for animals, no more need for blood, no more need for sacrifices. It doesn't get paid and it doesn't need to. So what these authors are saying throughout the New Testament is actually scandalous. They're saying this whole sacrificial system, because of Jesus, done. We do not need that anymore. No need for sacrifices. And even though the whole system and the metaphor is such a stretch for us because it's so foreign to our culture, I think the intent behind it is actually beautiful. Without getting into a ton of detail, it was this understanding that there was some sense of incompleteness or separation or lack of fullness between God and humanity, people and the sacred. And when I first became a Christian, this would have been, I was 16 in high school, atonement, and I think it was probably at summer camp, atonement was explained to me like this: at one-ment. Anybody else ever gotten this? This is atonement, right? This is how you and God are made one, which after 4 months in the letter of 1 John actually should sound very familiar. Because it's all about non-duality. It's about the returning of all things to unitive consciousness, God and people and the earth, all things made one. And in fact, Jesus' longest prayer at the end of the Gospel of John is essentially that all people would be one, would be united, they would experience this oneness with God and with each other. And so, yeah, atonement, especially substitutionary atonement, doesn't really work in our culture. It doesn't work for our mindset. It's weird. But the intent behind it, I think, is actually the echo of the same sacred ambition that calls all people, that appears in the world's religions, which is a call to oneness, this unitive experience, reconciliation, this deep and divine connection between people and all things. And even though we may no longer buy into the idea of having to kill an animal as a blood sacrifice for our sin, or even a large universal scale blood sacrifice of killing Jesus, the Son of God, in order to satisfy this bloodlust, we can get behind the idea of an atonement in the sense that what is happening in the Jesus story, what we're celebrating the birth of in Advent leading up to Christmas, is something that offers to unite us in love. It's the same call to the unity of people and God and the world. I want to clarify this because we don't do divinely mandated pledge percentages or expect additional temple offerings or taxes, and least of all do we offer this like pay per sin atonement shenanigans. And so it's important to say, I think during the pledge drive, we said last week, I think you can't buy your blessings here. I want to add this week, nor can you purchase guilt insurance. We don't do that either. Not a part of the way we understand the world or what it is that we're doing here. Yeah, right, the drop, right. Which budget do you want to give to? General, guilt insurance. You'll notice that's not there. And so, yeah, all this being said, this atoning sacrifice for our sin stuff, like I said, is actually the second thing on the list that this author lists as things that make Jesus unique. And even though this has become the obsession of modern evangelical Christianity, I actually don't think it's anywhere near the most important thing. I don't think it's the thing that actually makes Jesus unique, that makes Jesus so one of a kind. Before he says this, the author says, this is how God showed his love among us. He sent his, and it should say unique son instead of one and only, into the world, that we might live through him. Not a cosmic sacrifice to the bloodlust of a vengeful God, but so that we might experience a particular kind of life. Makes Jesus unique. The Greek word, and some of you said this in the conversation, the Greek word might live is actually a verb. It's an action. And specifically, this is the verb form of a noun that we've talked about over and over and over throughout this letter, sort of the focal point of the letter. The author says in the opening passage, we've experienced this life Jesus said was possible, and we want you to share in it. And this is the verb form of that kind of life. Does anyone want to remind us what that kind of life is? I know somebody remembers. Just be the nerd. Shout it out. Aeon Zoe. Aeon Zoe. This is the verb form of the word Zoe. And we said Zoe as compared to psyche, they're both translated life when they come to the English, but they're actually very different in experience. Zoe or Aeon Zoe, this is the life that the author says Jesus came to share, to reveal. As in, this life was already here, already all around us, just beneath the surface, just beneath the sea of our lives, woven into the fabric of all things. And we said Jesus did not create this. He merely revealed it. He pulled back this curtain and said, hey, this life is here. This experience of life in the world is here. Sink into it. Drink deeply of it. Rest in this kind of life. Rooted, grounded, ground of being, firmly planted in the experience of the unconditional. Aeon Zoe as compared to psyche, the other kind of life, which is conditional. And it's conditional. It's not good or bad. It's just conditional, meaning it rises and falls with the tides of circumstance, swells and diminishes with all the different conditions of life. Psyche is what happens to us in our life. It's dependent. It's conditional on the conditions of time and money and seasons, our emotions, the fluctuations of relationships and the market, jobs, loss, death, success, failure, all these things that move life around. That's the conditional experience of psyche. And this experience of Aeon Zoe is something that grounds us beneath those conditions. And they go by many different names, but I think in experience they're all very similar. Peace, stability, centeredness, enlightenment. It's the thing that we're looking for when we come to spiritual community. Wholeness. And so I think of it like this. As Floridians, we are profoundly grateful for the gift of what is called thermostat. For some of us, 75 is perfect. For some, it's a little too warm. Some, it's a little too cold. We can set it just right. And when the conditions are too hot or too humid or too gross, we come inside. And when we come inside, it's stable. It's temperate. It's nice. We have a place to go inside from the conditions. Sanctuary, rest. And this time of year, when it gets really nice outside and it's like 75 or better and perfect and gorgeous, guess what? We can go outside. When the conditions are good, we go and enjoy those conditions. The inside is always there. The thermostat can always be set. It provides stability. It provides sanctuary inside of those conditions. We can enjoy them. We can come inside from them. We can experience the unconditional gift of the thermostat. I think the invitation to this kind of life is Jesus' invitation to actually practice setting the thermostat, right? Which means we have to live in the world with all of its conditions, but we continue this rhythm of coming inside and pushing the button, up a degree, down a degree, sinking beneath the waves of those conditions, whatever's going on outside. It's Florida, so it's changing every 10 minutes. But the more we practice, and I think the more we love, the more we sit in silence, and we come to know ourselves in silence. We come to know God in silence. We listen for the Spirit. The more we exercise discernment, we begin to see more and more the unconditional within and beneath all of the conditions swirling around us. the weather, whether it's sweltering or gorgeous, the more we begin to experience Zoe, life, grounded, steady. But here's the trick. That's the noun, Zoe, as in that perfect temperature inside because we set the thermostat right. The gift of the thermostat, the temperature as a thing, but he says live, the verb. It's not Zoe, it's zozimane. It's not life as a thing. It's life as an action. It's life as a choice. It is life on purpose rather than life that just happens to you because it happens to be storming outside. And I love this. This Jack London quote captures this so well. He says, I would rather be ashes than dust. I would rather that my spark should burn out in a brilliant blaze than it should be stifled by dry rot. I would rather be a superb meteor, every atom of me in the magnificent glow, than a sleepy and permanent planet. The proper function of man is to live, not to exist. I shall not waste my days in trying to prolong them. I shall use my time. This is Zoe as a verb. To live on purpose, to choose every day as we set the thermostats of our life, to choose a way of being, which is the practice. It's setting our thermostats to this kind and quality of life. It's tuning our interior thermometers to life. And specifically, this is the practice. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us. And God's love is made perfect in us. Simple, right? There's the practice. Love one another. And everyone who does this is born of God. Are you going to hate some people along the way? Yeah, absolutely. Welcome to humanity. Don't stop doing this. Don't stop doing this. Love one another. Be born of God. And sure, the letter gets repetitive, but to be fair, we are forgetful. It may take 5 chapters of the same thing over and over for us to begin to let this sink in. When we set our thermostats to love, the life of God is alive in us. We are living, zozimane, this unconditional life. And when we do, the love of God is made complete in us. It achieves its point and purpose. This is like a self-fulfilling cycle of loving vitality. God is love each other and experience this deepest, fullest life, live this way, and God, who is love, by the way, is alive in us, which fulfills the purpose of it all, which is love, which inspires us to love one another, on and on and on. You sort of get the flywheel going, and it just keeps moving. God is love. Love is life. This life is love. That love is God. Live love. Live the experience of God. God's love is fulfilled in loving one another. And in that moment, it all begins again with a birth. We are born of God. And it all begins again. As we begin Advent, the birth of God in Christ has begun to open to us a universal call to love one another. For each and every person to be born of God. And at this time of year, certainly, we talk about sweet baby Jesus. We give special thanks. We pay close attention to this one-of-a-kind, unique child of God that we meet in Jesus. The one who grows up to pull back the curtain on this life of God that has been here all along. In and with us from the beginning, who pulls back the curtain on love and says, this is what it's all about. And by the way, this is what it's always been about. The one who just before he's killed for his scandalous life of love, he says, here's the new command, and it should sound familiar. You've had it from the beginning. Love one another. And then he breaks bread. And he offers a glass of wine to his friends. And what does he say? Because we're forgetful. He says, remember, practice, live this. Don't forget. Because tomorrow you might wake up and think it's about what you believe religiously. Don't buy it. Love one another. You might wake up and be afraid that you've been convinced to stop believing something that you always thought you needed to believe in order to be okay with God. Don't worry about it. Love one another. Be born of God. Again, practice it. Live it. Don't forget it. Set that thermostat. Set your inner life by love. Tune your heart to this love. Remember, remember, remember. This table of life and love and remembrance has been set. It is open again tonight to us and to all people. To all people. To our friend Jairo, who was able to come and visit this week from Canada. To our friend Shanti, who's tuned in tonight from Sweden. To the many people who are a part of this, even though they're not in the room. This table, and granted, they can't grab this bread and this wine, but they know where to get bread and wine. They're fine. The table, that table is open to us and to all people. And no one will ever be turned away. If you'd like, feel free to come and grab a piece of bread and dip it in the cup.